In the last section, we added in some validation to our user schema where we specifically required that the name must be a required property. So if a user ever tried to create a user without a name, we would return to them the message, name is required. In this section, we're going to move on a little bit by adding in an advanced validator on this name property. So required is great, but it just says, hey, was a value provided? It's very common that we want to add a validation on top of this thing to make sure that the user is passing something that is like actually well formatted. In this case, we want to add in a validation to ensure that the name is at least 2 characters long, or excuse me, longer than 2 characters, so at least 3 characters long. So Joe would be valid, Al would not. To add in a validation around a specific property, we can add another key to this configuration object being assigned to the name prop. So I'm going to add in another key here of validate. I'm going to assign an object to it. So validate will be looked at to find some information about how this thing or how this property should be validated whenever the validate function runs. We're going to assign 2 separate properties inside of this validate object. The first is one called validator, and it's going to be called as a function. Right now I'm just going to leave it empty. And the second will be the message that we want to show whenever the validator function fails, or whenever it returns specifically false. So because I expect validate, or excuse me, my name to be at least 3 characters, I think that a reasonable message to show to a user whenever this validator fails would be something like name must be longer than 2 characters. So then the validator function that we provide right here will be called with the name property, just the name by itself. So I'm going to reference name like so. And then inside this function, so right here, we need to add some bit of logic that either returns true or false. If we return true from this function, then it will be assumed that the property is valid. If we return false, you guessed it, it's going to be invalid. So in practice, sometimes this is a very tiny function. Sometimes it might be very large, something that you might even want to break out to a separate function to be defined in this file, just to make everything a little bit more legible. So for us, we have a pretty straightforward validation. We just want to make sure that the name's length is longer than 2 characters. So I can say name.length is greater than 2. So if we have 3, hey, that's going to pass, everything's valid. If it's got a length of 0, it's going to fail, and we should see a message provided back to us of name must be longer than 2 characters. Okay, so validation in the schema, the important things to remember, you must pass a validate property. It should point at an object that has a validator function and a message to show if the record is invalid. So now that we've defined our validation, we can flip over to our validation test file and write a test to make sure that we can see this error message if the user is not valid. So I'm going to flip over to validation test, and then we'll add on a second it block. So it requires a username longer than 2 characters. You'll notice that I'm being a little bit inconsistent here by saying username. I really should just be saying name or the place. You know, we could just as well like put a quote in there and be like, okay, well, a user's name must be longer than 2 characters, but you get the idea. Okay, so in this function, we're going to end up with something that looks very similar to the test right above it. We'll create a user, we'll produce a validation result, and then we'll make an assertion about the message that is produced. So we will start off by making our user. I'm going to give them a name of Al, so just 2 characters. Then we will produce our validation result, which will be generated by validate sync because we're not doing any asynchronous validation here. Everything is just a simple function that's going to run without making any asynchronous requests or anything like that. Then we can look at the message property from the validation result. It will should again be assigned to the errors.name property. If it's not, well, we'll see our test fail and we can fix it up. And then we can assert that the message is equal to the message that we just provided inside of our schema file, which should be name must be longer than 2 characters. So just to make sure I don't make any typos here, I'm just going to do a copy and I'll paste it over here. Okay, so I think this just about looks good. I'm going to save this. Let's see how our spec is looking. So when I flip over, okay, 15 successes, sounds good to me. Just to make sure everything's going correctly, I'm going to change the validation message inside my test, save it, and okay, fantastic, I get an error. You'll notice that I do that very often. I will like change my test even when it's passing just to see it fail. The idea behind testing, or I shouldn't say the idea, but definitely a very good practice, is to make sure that you see your test fail at least one time before you assume that it's running correctly. It could absolutely be the case that, especially in the case of the all the tests that we wrote with promises, so like here's one of the ones with a promise, it could entirely be the case that we accidentally chain on something like .10 or something like this. And it might be actually valid, right? And of course we have the done in here kind of as a catch or a safety. But all I'm really trying to get at here is that it's not entirely uncommon for us to have a test that might be accidentally passing, either because the assertion is not being called or because we wrote the assertion poorly. And so just to make sure that we don't make simple errors like that, a very quick thing to do is to just make the test fail one time, see it go red inside your terminal, and then you've got a at least somewhat reasonable feeling that, yeah, your test is actually doing the right thing to at least some degree. Okay, so we've seen a pretty straightforward example of validation. Let's continue the next section and work on another advanced topic.